letting go, if we use that term as an equivalent for equanimity, will certainly, on the average, eventually cause us to feel better and better and better. However, for short periods of time, particularly in the early years of one's practice, one can go through periods where the deeper one goes, the more uncomfortable one becomes. One of the classic manifestations of that is the more we relax, the more icky, sticky, yucky kinds of antsy, unbearable sensations arise within us. I have a whole article about that. I call it the icky, sticky, creepy, crawly, doesn't really hurt, but I can't stand it flavor of sensation. That has a very peculiar characteristic that the deeper you drop into samadhi and the more you relax, the yuckier it gets, at least for a while, creating a negative feedback loop, causing a person to be disinclined to drop into the deeper states. In fact, I once heard a senior Burmese teacher who I had studied with, U Silananda, referred to it as samadhi pain in English. I'd never heard that phrase. Maybe he made it up. But clearly he was familiar with the phenomenon. So that's one of the forms that going deeper makes things yuckier. There are other manifestations of that disorientation. For example, you go deep and you sort of get disoriented, or you seem more vulnerable, et cetera, et cetera. I can only say that these are temporary phenomena. They're not characteristic of the big picture, the long-term practice. Essentially, we can say that the spiritual path is a path of shedding gradually one coping mechanism and acquiring another coping mechanism for life. The coping mechanism that's being shed could be succinctly characterized as deal with what comes from the outside and comes from the inside by tighten up and turn away. That sort of works. It armors. It's basically an armoring and denying strategy, which can sort of blunt things, but in the end doesn't really work very well. So hopefully a person will eventually mature to the point where they realize, oh, there's a better way of going about dealing with the impact of the intensity of the outside and the stored poison and pain on the inside. And they cultivate that better way. The tricky thing is that that better way is ultimately a better way. However, it is the diametric opposite of the former way. It could be succinctly characterized as open up and turn towards. The open up is the equanimity piece. The turn towards is the sensory clarity piece. So because it's the exact opposite of the previous strategy, it's difficult to avoid what I call awkward intermediate states, where the old strategy is being shed so it can't quite shield you anymore. In other words, the mesh of your being is somewhat opening, but it makes you vulnerable because it's not so open that the slings and arrows will pass through without catching. But you don't have the tight mesh that sort of shields you. So that creates this awkward intermediate stage. And there's no way around it because that's the price of going from one coping mechanism to another. If we think of enlightenment as the most stable state, the ground state of our being, then there are other states that would not be as deep as that, okay? So let's say that we're in a relatively grounded state here, but we would like to go to the global optimal, the most grounded state possible for the system. which might be called our source. Well, it will often happen that in a thermodynamic system, in order to make the transition from a relative ground state to an absolute ground state, one has to go over this metastable, ungrounded situation. And so one actually passes through a lot of those things, but there'll be a tendency to drop eventually to the deepest ground state. So that's sort of the price one pays, may have to pay, for moving on to the next level of well-being.